I have kept a store in Cottonwood Bend for 41 years, and in all that time I never sold a single thing that changed a life the way a folded square of paper did. The autumn it slid out of a borrowed book and landed face down on Marin Ashby's reading room floor. I was there when it fell. I had carried a crate of returned books over from my counter to hers, the way I did every Saturday, because folks left their borrowed volumes with me as often as with her, and I was not above an excuse to cross the street and stand a while in the one cool, quiet room in that dusty town. It was late August, the year the wells ran low and the corn stood brown and rattling, and the whole of the high plains lay under a sky the color of scorched tin. The Ashby lending room smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and the dried lavender Marin kept in a saucer, and it was the only place in Cottonwood Bend a man could go and not be asked his business. I set the crate on her table. She was up the ladder reshelving, in that gray dress she'd worn so long the cuffs had gone the color of ash, and she said, without turning, "You've brought back the Prout boy's primer, I hope. He's had it since planting." "I have," and a stack of others somebody pushed under my door in the night, ashamed to be seen returning them late. She came down the ladder. Marin Ashby was 1840 that year, and the town had long since decided what she was. Plain, they said, dried up. A spinster who'd grow old behind her father's counter and die there among the dust and the spines, never having been chosen by a living soul. They said it kindly enough, the way you'd say a field had gone to weed, and they said it in front of her as though her ears had retired along with her prospects. I am ashamed now to tell you I said it too. We all did. It was the easiest thing in the world to look at a quiet woman in a gray dress and decide there was nothing underneath it worth the trouble of looking closer. She knelt by the crate and began sorting, and that was when the book fell open. An old cloth-bound thing, water-stained at the corner, a book of poems that had gone out of that room before I ever clerked across the street. Somebody's grandmother had died and the heirs had cleared the house and dumped the lot in my crate to be rid of it. The book dropped from Marin's hands when its cracked spine gave, and out of the middle of it fluttered that folded square, yellow as an old tooth, and it landed at her knee. She picked it up. She unfolded it the way you'd open anything that old, careful, expecting it to crumble. And then I watched the color go out of her face and then come roaring back into it, all at once, and her hand closed on the paper like a trap. "What is it?" I said. "Nothing." She stood too fast. "An old market list. Somebody's old." She did not finish. She put it in her apron pocket and turned to the shelves, and her hands, when she reached up, were not steady. I should have let it lie. I want that on the record, old as I am now and close as I am to answering for the whole of my life. I should have let that woman have her nothing. But I am a storekeeper, and a storekeeper is a man who trades all day in other folks' business, and I am sorry to say the habit had soaked clear through to the bone. "Looked like more than a market list," I said. She did not answer me, and I let it go that day. But Orpha Meade had been sitting in the corner the whole while with a borrowed novel open on her knee, and Orpha Meade had eyes that could read a label across a dark room, and a mouth that never in its life kept what those eyes took in. By Tuesday the whole town knew that Marin Ashby was hiding a love letter. That is not what it was. I want to say that plainly here at the start, because the town got it wrong from the first word, and the wrong of it nearly cost two people the only good thing the Lord ever said in front of either of them. But the town did not know that yet, and neither did I, and what the town heard was this, that the spinster at the lending room had found a letter so tender, so full of longing, that she'd gone white reading it and hidden it against her heart. And the town, having decided long ago that Marin Ashby was a woman nothing ever happened to, fell on the news like dogs on a dropped roast. Who'd written it, who it was for, whether the dried-up old maid had a secret after all, some man somewhere who'd loved her once or loved her still. They turned it every way. Orpha Meade held court at the dry goods counter and swore she'd glimpsed the words over Marin's shoulder, swore it spoke of a heart that would wait through every winter the good Lord sent, and that phrase went around the bend like a grass fire. Women repeated it at the pump. Men chewed it over at the rail of my store, grinning. Because there is no sport on God's earth a small dry town loves better than the love life of someone it has decided is past having won. Reckon the schoolmaster wrote it, said Cole Prout, who farmed the section north and had nothing better to do in a dry August than lean on my counter. He's the only man in 20 Mile owns more than 3 books. Schoolmaster's 19, I said. Old letter, maybe, from back when she was young enough to look at. That was the cruelty in it, you understand, and the men did not even hear themselves say it. Back when she was young enough to look at. As though there were a window of years in which a woman was worth a glance, and Marin Ashby had stood at it too plain and too quiet and missed her turn, and now the only romance the town could imagine for her was a moldering one, dead and folded and 30 years gone. I'd like to tell you I corrected them. I'd like to tell you a great many things about myself that aren't so. What I did was watch the lending room go strange. Folks who'd not opened a book since their own schooling suddenly developed a powerful thirst for reading. They came in 2s and 3s, pretending to browse, drifting their fingers along the spines, sneaking looks at Marin the way you'd look at a creek you suspected of hiding gold. They asked her sly questions. They left books open on the table hoping she'd reveal which shelf the old poems had come from. Orpha Meade came in daily and sat in her corner and watched, just watched, with the patience of a hawk on a fence post. And Marin bore it. That is the thing I came to understand only later and too slow. She bore it the way she'd borne 30 years of being looked through. She kept her counter. She mended the broken spines. She read the little ones their letters on Thursday afternoons, the only soul in town who'd take the time, and if her face was tighter than before and her eyes went often to the window, only a man paying real attention would have marked it, and there was not such a man in Cottonwood Bend. Until there was. Eli Cobb rode in the second Saturday of September with 2 books in his saddlebag, and a face like the north side of a barn. I knew Cobb the way the whole county knew him, which is to say not at all. He ran cattle out past the creek, 1,200 acres he'd broken with his own hands, and he'd buried his wife Ruth out there under a cottonwood 8 years before and had not, so far as anyone could tell, spoken a soft word since. He came to town 4 times a year for what he could not raise or make, paid in coin, said little and rode out. Folks gave him room. There was a stillness on the man that warned you off, the stillness of a thing that has been broken and rewelded harder than it was made. I was on my porch when he tied up across the street, and I watched him take the 2 books out of his bag and stand there in the road with them in his big scarred hands, looking at the lending room door like it was a river he'd as soon not cross. He stood there a good while. Then he set his jaw and went in, and I, being who I am, found I had urgent business sweeping a porch that was already clean. What I heard through the open windows, I have turned over so many nights, since that I could set it to music. I'm told this is where books come back to, Cobb said. His voice was rust on rust. It is, Marin's voice even, you'd be Mr. Cobb. These were my wife's. A pause you could have driven a wagon through. She borrowed them before. I found them this summer going through, I found them, and I didn't know what a man's to do with another fellow's books, so here they are. I expect there's a fine. There's no fine, Mr. Cobb. There's 8 years of fine. There's no fine, Marin said again, gentle and final, the way you'd ease a board down so it wouldn't crack. She'd have been welcome to keep them 8 years more. I'd rather have had the reading of them out in your house than the dust of them in mine. I heard nothing for a moment. Then I heard the particular sound of a man's breath when something he has held a long time shifts in his chest, and I want you to understand I had never once in 8 years heard a sound like that come out of Eli Cobb. What were they? He said, quieter. What was she reading? I never asked her. There's a great deal I never asked her. And Marin Ashby, who could have said any cold, true thing about a stranger's dead wife, said, one's a book of letters. People who lived far apart and wrote to each other their whole lives, year on year, and you read them grow old together a page at a time. The other's poems. She'd marked one. There's a thumbprint of flour on the corner, like she stopped her baking to find it again. I heard him say, "Which one?" And I heard her cross the room and find the book and find the page, and I did not hear what she read him because she read it low, just for him, the way you'd read to someone at a sickbed. But I heard, when she'd done, the long silence of a hard man holding still so he would not come apart in a stranger's room. And then I heard him say, rough, "I'll take that one. If a man can, I'll pay for it." "You'll borrow it," Marin said. "That's what the room is for. You bring it back when you're ready, Mr. Cobb, or you don't. I'll not chase you for it." He came out with the book of poems held against his chest the way a man holds a thing he's afraid to drop, and he did not see me on my porch, and that was the first I ever saw of the look that would, by and by, undo the both of them. He had gone in a stranger and come out a man who had been seen, just for a minute, by somebody who took the trouble to look. It is a powerful thing to do for a person. It is more powerful by far when the person has done without it, as long as those two had. He rode out. I thought that was the end of it. A grief-shut rancher and a passed-over spinster, 2 stones in the same dry creek, never to touch again. I have never in my life been more wrong about anything, and I have been wrong about a great deal. He came back the next Saturday. He came back the Saturday after that. He brought the poems and borrowed the letters, the book of 2 people growing old a page at a time, and he sat in the lending room a full hour to read it where, I came to understand, he could ask her what a word meant or what a writer meant by it. Because Eli Cobb had been pulled out of school at 9 to work cattle and could read a brand and a price and little else, and was too proud to let it be known, and had found the one soul in the county who would teach a 55-year-old man his letters without once letting him feel the shame of it. That is what they were doing, those long afternoons the town was watching and grinning over. They thought he was courting. He was learning to read. And she was teaching him, patient as creek water, and somewhere in those hours of his thick finger under her quiet voice, the 2 of them were courting after all, only neither of them had the first idea, having both been so long convinced that such a thing was for other people. Now I must tell you the part I am least proud of, and then the part that redeems all the rest. The town's appetite for the letter had not died. It had only banked itself like a fire under ash, waiting. And when folks saw Eli Cobb's horse at the lending room rail 4 Saturdays running, the fire jumped. The 2 stories braided in the town's mouth into one. The secret love letter and now the secret suitor. They decided, with the certainty of people who have nothing to lose by being wrong, that Eli Cobb had written it. The grief-shut rancher, 8 years a widower, pouring out his locked-up heart in a letter to the spinster who'd captured it, too shy to sign his name. It was a sweeter story than the truth in its way. It was also a lie, and lies like that have weight, and the weight came down where it always does, on the one least able to bear it. I heard Orphamede say it at my own counter. It's him, plain as day. Cobb wrote it and lost his nerve and now can't keep away. And her, well, a little laugh. You'd think the woman would be grateful, at her age, to be wanted at all. And then the line that I have not forgiven her for, nor myself for hearing it and saying nothing, though Lord knows what a man like that sees in a dried-up old thing like Marin Ashby. Pity dressed up as love, if you ask me. He's lonesome is all. Any port in a storm. She said it Saturday noon. The lending room windows were open, and Marin Ashby was on her own porch not 20 feet off, watering the one geranium she kept alive against all that dry season, and she heard every word. I saw her hear it. I was crossing the street with the mail. I saw her hand go still on the can, and the water run over and over the rim and onto her shoe, and she did not move to stop it. And her face did the thing a face does when a person decides, all in a moment, to believe the worst that has just been said about them. Because they have been told it so long in so many ways that it has come to seem only fair. Pity dressed up as love, any port in a storm. She set the can down. She went inside. And when Eli Cobb rode in not an hour later with his borrowed book, the door of the lending room was bolted in the middle of a Saturday for the first time in 30 years, and a card was hung in the window in her plain, straight hand. Closed. He stood in the road. He knocked. He called her name once low. There was no answer, and after a while he tied the book to his saddle and rode out, and the set of his shoulders going was a thing I could not watch. That was the day I might have mended it and did not. I had the truth in my hands, you see, or half of it. I knew those afternoons were lessons. I knew the man could barely read. I knew the love letter and Eli Cobb had nothing to do with one another. I could have crossed the street and told her so. I could have stood up at my own counter and told Orpha Meade to hush her cruel mouth. I did neither. I was a storekeeper who liked his neighbors to keep buying flour, and Orpha Meade bought a great deal of flour, and I let a good woman bolt her door against the one good thing in her life, because I had not the spine to spend a little goodwill on her account. The bend went into October. The first hard frost came and laid the gardens flat. The lending room opened again. Marin was too proud and too needful of the few coins it brought to keep it shut, but something had gone out of it. She kept her counter with her eyes down. The afternoon lessons stopped because Cobb stopped coming. The town, deprived of its show, lost interest by degrees the way a town will, and turned to the price of beef and the lateness of the rain. And the letter sank back under the ash, and folks forgot Marin Ashby all over again, which I came by then to see was the cruelest thing of all, not that they'd watched her, but how easily they quit. It was the third week of October that the truth came out, and it came out because Eli Cobb, who had been raised to leave a thing alone and had spent 8 years getting very good at it, for once in his stony life refused to. He came to my store at dusk, when the street was empty, and he stood at my counter turning his hat in his hands like a younger and softer man. "Tanner," he said, "you hear things." "I hear most things." "This letter," he had trouble with it. "The one they say I wrote, the one she found." He looked at me square. "I didn't write it, I want that known, but I'd give a deal to know what it says and who it's for, because she shut her door the day they said it was mine, and a man doesn't shut a door that hard on a thing that means nothing to him." He set his hat down. "I read slow, Tanner, you may know that or not. She was teaching me. That's all the town saw and got wrong. But I sat in that room every Saturday, and I'll tell you what I'd come to think sitting there. I'd come to think I'd as soon sit in that room the rest of my days as anywhere on this earth, and I have not thought I'd as soon do anything the rest of my days since I put Ruth in the ground." He stopped. His jaw worked. "Now they've gone and made it dirty, made it pity. And she believes them because that's what the world's told her whole life, and I can't get through the door to tell her it's a lie. I have done few decent things in my life worth setting down. Here is one. I told him the truth, or I told him to go get it from the only place it lived. The book it fell out of," I said. "The old poems, water-stained, came in with the Hendry estate when the old woman died. Her maiden name was Hart." I watched him take that in. "There was a Hart family broke ground here 30 years ago, out past where your west fence runs now. Had a boy, Wesley. Drove cattle south one spring to earn his stake and took a fever on the trail and died of it before he ever came home, and the family sold up and scattered, and that book of poems was old Mrs. Hart's, and where it sat 30 years gathering dust I couldn't say." I leaned on my counter. "But I'll tell you who was a girl of 18 the spring Wesley Hart rode south, and who has kept this town's books and read this town's children their letters ever since, and never in 30 years let a man come near her, and went white as a sheet the day a letter fell out of a Hart book onto her own floor." Eli Cobb stood very still. "You think she wrote it?" he said. "I think," I said, "you ought to go ask her, and not on a Saturday with the street full of mouths. I think you ought to go tonight." He went. I did not see what passed between them that night, and Marin has never told me all of it, and Eli Cobb would no more recount such a thing than he'd dance on my counter. But I have pieced it from this, and that across the years we were all neighbors after, and I will give it to you as near true as an old man can. He rode out to the bend's edge where the lending room stood with one lamp burning, and he knocked, and when she would not open, he did not call her name and did not go away. He sat down on her step in the cold with his back against her bolted door, and he said, loud enough to carry through it, that he would sit there till morning if he had to, because he had a thing to say, and she could hear it through an inch of pine, or she could hear it to his face, but she was, by God, going to hear it. And then this hard, half-lettered man, who had not strung 10 soft words together in 8 years, said them through a door to a woman who would not look at him. He said he had not written the letter. He said he knew now who had, and he knew now who Wesley Hart had been, and he wanted her to hear that he was not sorry she had loved a boy 30 years dead, because a heart that could write what hers had written at 18 was a heart he'd give the rest of his years to sit beside. He said the town was wrong, that it wasn't pity and it wasn't loneliness, and it wasn't any port in any storm. He said, and this is the part Marin did finally tell me, one Christmas, with her eyes wet and that same plain straight mouth trying not to smile, he said, Ruth taught me what a wife is. You taught me what a word is. I'd not have believed at my age a man could be hungry to learn a thing he ought to have known at 9, and walk into that room every Saturday hungry for it, and find out somewhere around the 2nd month that it wasn't the words I was hungry for. I don't know the fine way to say it. I never learned the fine way to say anything, but I know I rode home those evenings feeling like a man instead of a grave, and I'd not have that taken from me by Orpha Meade's mean mouth, and I'd not have you take it from yourself. And Marin Ashby opened the door. She had the letter in her hand. She had carried it on her person, I learned, every day since it fell, not because she'd lost the boy, she said, but because she'd lost the girl who wrote it, the girl who'd believed at 18 that she was the kind of person something might happen to. She had folded that girl away in a book the spring Wesley died and had spent 30 years being the other kind, the kind nothing happens to, the gray fixture among the shelves, and she'd done it so long and so well that when the letter fell out and the town began to wonder aloud who could possibly love a woman like her, she had no answer ready but the one the town gave. Nobody. Not really. Not for true. She read him the letter on the step that night, the whole of it in the cold by the one lamp. I have heard a few lines of it, the lines that got loose into the town early and that Eli would, in later years, repeat to her across our supper table just to watch her color rise. It was a young girl's letter, and a fine one, that she would wait through every winter the good Lord sent, that she had never said a true word to a soul that she had not first said in her own head to him, that her heart kept a room in it lit and swept and waiting, and would, whether he came or not. She had never sent it. The fever took him on the trail before she found the nerve. She had folded it into his mother's book, the only thing of the family she could lay hands on after, and the book had wandered 30 years through estate sales and dusty crates, until it came home to the very room where she had grown into a woman nobody looked at, and fell open at her feet, and told her in her own girl's hand a thing she'd stopped believing, that she had once had a heart worth the writing down. What Eli Cobb did then was the thing I'd been waiting 40 years in that town to see somebody do. He did not pity her. He did not say a soft, sad thing about the boy or the years or the waste. He took the letter, gentle, and folded it back the way she'd kept it, and he handed it to her, and he said, "That room you wrote about, lit and swept and waiting," he said, "I've got one out at my place answers to it, has for 8 years. I'd be honored if you'd come see does it suit." That is how Eli Cobb proposed. Not on his knees, not with a ring he didn't have. He offered a plain woman a lit room in a hard man's house, which was the only thing he owned that mattered, and asked did it suit, and Marin Ashby, who had kept her own counter and her own counsel and her own name for 30 years and meant to go on keeping all 3, said it might. She said she'd not give up the lending room nor close it, that the town's children needed their Thursday letters whatever the town thought of her, and that she'd keep it in her own name till she died. And Eli Cobb, who'd have agreed to live in a creek bed by then, said a woman who'd teach a town to read was not a woman a sane man asked to quit, and that he'd build a shelf onto the ranch house long as her arm, and they'd carry the best of the books out and back as suited her. They were married in November, the morning of the first snow, by the same reverend who'd buried Ruth. There was no crowd. There hadn't been a crowd to anything of Marin's in 30 years, and she did not want one now. But I was there, and I'll tell you who else came, uninvited and unwelcome and shamed clear through. Half the town. They stood at the back of the little church in the snowlight, and they could not meet her eye, because the story had got round at last. The real one. The storekeeper's fault for letting it loose, which is the one good loose-lipped act of my life. They had spent 30 years deciding Marin Ashby was a woman with nothing under the gray, and a folded square of paper had proved them wrong in front of God and everybody. And there is no congregation on earth that squirms like one that has just learned it, overlooked a soul for 3 decades running. Orpha Meade did not come. I'll grant her that much grace. She had the sense to stay home. But Cole Prout came and stood at the back twisting his hat, the same man who'd grinned at my rail about whether she'd been young enough to look at. And when it was done, he went up to Eli Cobb with his eyes on his boots and said he was glad and meant it. And Eli looked at him a long moment and said only, "She was always worth the looking, Cole. The looking was on us." And that was the whole of his revenge, and it was enough, and it shamed that man more than a beating would have. Now I am old, and most of what I have told you is 30 years gone itself, and the both of them are buried out past the creek under the cottonwood, side by side, Ruth on the one hand and Marin on the other, which Marin arranged herself and would hear no argument about, saying the man had room in him for 2 and she'd not be the one to make him choose. They had near 30 years. They never had children of their own, they'd come to it too late for that. But I do not think there was a child in Cottonwood Bend in all those years who did not learn his letters at Marin Cobb's Thursday table, my own grandchildren among them. And there is not one of those grown men and women who, told that Marin Ashby was a plain spinster nothing ever happened to, would not put you straight in a hurry. I kept the store another 20 years after the wedding. I sold a great many things across that counter, useful things, flour and nails and lamp oil and cloth. But I never again let myself forget what I learned the August the letter fell, which is that the world is full of folks we have decided are nothing in particular gray fixtures we look clean through, and that nearly every one of them is carrying, folded small and kept close, a letter in their own young hand that would break your heart if you ever took the trouble to ask to read it. Eli Cobb learned to read well enough in the end to read that letter back to her himself, slow and careful, every year on the anniversary of the snow. I know because I was at the table for a good many of them. And every year, when he came to the line about the room kept lit and swept and waiting, that hard old man's rust-on-rust voice would go to nothing, and he'd reach across and put his scarred hand over her plain one, and Marin Ashby, who the whole town had sworn would grow old alone among her books, would look at him like a girl of 18 who had finally been asked to read aloud the things she'd been too afraid to send. I have sold many things. I never sold anything worth that, and I had it for free across a street every Saturday for the price of crossing over and taking the trouble to look.